In this tutorial, I'm going to cover making drop shadows for the figures in this composition. Right now they seem like they're floating in air, and the drop shadows will have to follow the contour of the floor. The floor implies a one-point perspective. So I've merged the figures on their respective layers together so that I'm working with one layer. I've got essentially two layers with figures merged, three to a layer. I'll start with the layer in front, and with the layer selected in the layer window, I'm going to go to FX and I'm going to choose Drop Shadow. Now in the Drop Shadow feature that's built into Photoshop, there are a number of things you can do with it. But all I want right now is a simple silhouette that mirrors the figures themselves. So I've gone in and I've reduced the spread and the size to 0. I've got a default of black and I have the opacity 100%. Once I separate them out as their own layer, I can deal with all those other particulars, so I don't have to really do anything more than that here. I might have moved the distance so I can actually see the shape of the shadow and determine if that's what I wanted. And that's going to work pretty well for this. So once I've applied a shadow, I'll click OK. Now in the layer, you'll see an extra layer has been generated, the drop shadow layer. If I were to right click on that, I'm going to see the option to create layer. And I'm going to click OK. And what that essentially did was it separated out the shadow layer from the figures. So if I were to turn the actual figure layer off, the silhouette below is the separated shadow layer. Now, the shadow itself only would work if the wall were parallel behind them. So I need to lay this down in a way that it follows the contour of the background now, that one-point perspective. I'll select the shadow layer and I'll go to Edit, Transform, and choose Distort. Now, there are bounding boxes on the corners and on the insides here. And with that translate to under Distort is that I can grab these and move them individually and essentially distort this image. I'm going to click on the middle one, and in doing so I can now drag it down to follow the contour of my ground. So once I have something that I find acceptable, I'll go ahead and I'll click on the check mark, or I'll hit Enter or Return depending on whether you're on a Mac or a PC, and now that shadow follows the contour of a ground. At this point I might play with the opacity inside the layer. And if it were an interior, I might go to Filter and choose Blur and choose Gaussian Blur. And I might put a bit of a blur on that just to soften the edges. And I'm going to click OK. Now very often when light falls in an artificial environment, the shadows might be more prominent close to where the light source is. And you can see that the floor is brighter in the front here. So I'm now going to put a layer mask on it, and I'm going to get my brush, and I'll right click inside my document window and I'll make that brush edge soft, 100%. Now I'm going to set the brush opacity lower than 100. I'll probably set it for 30. And then I'll start to soften or hide some of the shadow, perhaps up where the figures are. I'm going to do the same thing to the other layer in the back. Once again, I'll go to FX, Drop Shadow, and the setting pretty much remains the same from the prior one, so all I have to do is click OK, select the shadow layer in the layer itself, go to Create Layers, click OK. I'll select it, go to Edit, Transform, Distort, and I'll put that down into the position that I would want. And if I needed to, I would soften it by going to Filter, clicking on the Gaussian Blur, adding a layer mask, dropping the opacity perhaps again, and then with my layer mask selected, I'll get my brush and I'll soften the back of that one as well. And that's pretty much how to create those shadows that follow a contour that you may have created in your floor.